He just stood there in the doorway, looking at me, and for the first time, I didn't look away. It wasn't love at first sight. It was something more dangerous, a moment when you suddenly want to be yourself, even if everything around you says you shouldn't. Max hadn't planned to spend the week at someone else's house. His apartment wasn't supposed to flood. The repairs weren't supposed to take that long. Jamie, his best friend since freshman year, offered his family home as a safe haven while Max waited out the mess. It was supposed to be easy. Same couch, same dumb inside jokes, same late-night pizza debates. Familiar. But when the front door opened, it wasn't Jamie who greeted him. The man standing there was taller, broader. A stillness about him made the air feel heavier. Caleb, Jamie's older brother. Former Army, quiet, reserved. Max had only met him once before, years ago. He remembered someone colder then. This time, Caleb didn't smile, just gave a silent nod and stepped back to let Max in. Inside, the silence felt loaded. Jamie had been called away on a work trip, apparently. Caleb explained it with few words and no expression. Max's bag thudded softly on the floor as he took in the unfamiliar familiarity of the place. It smelled like lemon cleaner, something else, maybe the past, maybe just memory. Caleb didn't ask questions. He didn't offer a tour or conversation. Just said the guest room was still down the hall and returned to whatever he was doing. Max nodded, unsure whether to speak or disappear. He tried to remind himself this was temporary. But even on the first night, he noticed it. The silence wasn't just absence. It was something active, watching, listening, waiting. Caleb wasn't rude, but there was a distance in his voice, like every word cost something. At dinner, which Caleb cooked without asking if Max wanted anything, the conversation was dry and scattered. Max found himself over-explaining banal details of his freelance design work just to fill the space. Caleb listened, eyes steady but said little. Max told himself it was fine. He didn't need the guy to like him. They just had to coexist for a few days. But that night, lying in the guest room with the lights off, Max couldn't stop thinking about the way Caleb's gaze had lingered. Not long, not inappropriate. Just curious. Waited. Noticed. The second day, they barely saw each other until evening. Caleb kept to himself, vanishing into the garage or out for a run. Max stayed indoors, alternating between answering client emails and pretending to care about whatever was playing on TV. It was when Max went to refill his water in the kitchen that they crossed paths again, abruptly. Caleb had just come in from outside, sweat still glistening on his collarbone, breathing shallow. Their eyes met. Max offered a quick smile, more reflex than anything. Caleb just nodded, walked past him, and grabbed a glass from the cupboard. Max turned to leave, but Caleb's voice stopped him. "You okay here?" The question caught Max off guard. He nodded, said something about being grateful for the space. Caleb nodded in return, that same guarded nod, and turned his back again. The moment wasn't remarkable, but it stuck. In that night, Max found himself lying awake longer than usual, thinking not about his flooded apartment or missed deadlines, but about the line in Caleb's brow when he spoke. The quiet in his voice that sounded a little too practiced, like someone who didn't trust the sound of his own thoughts. On the third day, Max woke up to the sun bleeding through the blinds, casting pale lines across the bed. He shuffled out into the hallway in boxers and a t-shirt, hair a mess, heading for coffee, and froze. Caleb was already in the kitchen. Max stopped. Caleb looked up. There was a second too long between their glances. Not awkward, not heated, just still. Then Caleb turned back to the stove and asked if Max drank his coffee black. That morning felt different. The way they moved around each other. Two bodies sharing a space, no longer pretending not to notice. Max caught himself watching the muscles in Caleb's arm as he stirred eggs. He didn't mean to, but Caleb didn't call him out on it. Just handed him a plate and sat across the table, eyes downcast. They ate quietly. Later, when Max offered to wash the dishes, Caleb didn't protest. He dried each plate methodically, as if every motion had been trained in a muscle memory. When their hands touched, briefly, over a fork, Max felt it like a current. Neither of them said a word about it. That night, Max dreamt in half-formed flashes. A hand at his back, breath near his ear, a weightless closeness he couldn't name. He woke up disoriented, heart racing, blanket half off the bed. He shook it off, told himself it was nothing. But the tension wasn't imaginary. It gathered in the air each time they passed in the hallway. Each time Caleb brushed by with that unreadable look. It wasn't hostility. It wasn't desire exactly. It was something suspended, undefined, dense. Max hated that he noticed. He hated more that he wanted to. On the fourth day, Jamie texted, "Stuck out of town till Saturday. Hope you and Caleb aren't killing each other." Max stared at the message, thumb hovering above the screen, unsure how to answer. What would he even say? That Caleb never asked personal questions? That the silence between them felt more intimate than anything spoken? That sometimes he caught Caleb watching him, not just looking but seeing? He replied with a single thumbs up. Later that afternoon, Max walked past Caleb's open door on the way to the laundry. He didn't mean to look in, but there was Caleb sitting on the edge of the bed, shirtless, towel around his neck. A slow breath rising and falling in his chest. Caleb didn't flinch at being seen. He didn't reach for a shirt. Just looked at Max with that same unreadable calm. Max looked back. For a heartbeat, nothing moved. Then Caleb gave a slight nod, barely perceptible, and Max turned away, continuing down the hall. In his chest, something heavy twisted. By the fifth day, the silence was no longer silence. It had texture, shape, rules. They didn't speak of anything direct, but they shared small things, the last slice of toast, a joke about the weather, a moment standing too close in the hallway. The nearness was always accidental, always brief, and yet never meaningless. At dinner, Caleb mentioned a deployment, casually, like he didn't mean for Max to hear it. Max listened, heart tightening. There were gaps in Caleb's stories. Names left out, emotions stripped away. But Max heard what wasn't said. He didn't press. Instead, he said something quiet about how not everyone who comes back from war leaves the battlefield behind. Caleb didn't answer, but he didn't look away either. That night, they ended up on opposite ends of the couch, a movie playing in the background. Max pretended to scroll his phone. Caleb sat still, hands steepled in front of him, eyes unfocused. The room felt too small for two people pretending nothing was happening. When Max reached for the remote, their fingers touched. He didn't flinch. Neither did Caleb. It was nothing. It was everything. The next morning, Max woke up feeling like someone else. Not someone new, just someone he hadn't allowed himself to be. He thought about the look Caleb gave him in the hallway yesterday. Not intrusive, not asking, just open. Max had spent years looking for that kind of gaze. Later that day, as he reached for a cup in the kitchen, Caleb stepped behind him. Not close enough to touch, but close enough to feel. Neither of them spoke. Max stood still, letting the silence say what words couldn't. He knew he shouldn't stay longer than necessary. That Jamie would be back soon. That this wasn't supposed to mean anything. But nothing about this week had gone according to plan. And when he turned around and met Caleb's eyes that said, "I see you," Max felt it again. That moment, the one more dangerous than love at first sight. The moment when hiding stops working, and suddenly, being seen is the only thing that matters. It began with nothing. A shared cup of coffee in the morning, passed without comment. A soundless nod exchanged across the kitchen as they crossed paths again and again. It could have stayed that way, quiet, forgettable like every other transient moment between acquaintances. But there was something different in the silence now. Not empty, not polite, observant, present. Max noticed how Caleb's gaze lingered an extra beat too long when he thought no one was watching. But Max was. He always was now. It wasn't just the way Caleb moved, deliberate, economical. It was how he existed in the room, as if every gesture was holding something back. The tension didn't burst. It crept. At first, Max told himself he was imagining it, that maybe he was reading too much into things, a glance here, a pause there. But it built up in pieces. In a way, Caleb's hand brushed his on the fridge handle. In a way, Max caught himself listening for Caleb's footsteps, measuring their weight, their pace, their direction. He began to memorize patterns without meaning to. Caleb never sat with his back to the window. He always drank water before eating. He tapped the edge of his mug twice before each sip. Not habit, more like ritual. Max had no idea why any of it mattered. He just knew that it did. One afternoon, while Max stood folding a towel, Caleb stepped into the laundry room without warning. The space between them instantly shrank. There was no eye contact at first, just the air, suddenly heavier. Max didn't move. Neither did Caleb. The silence wasn't awkward. It was charged. Max could feel the warmth of him, the slight shift in the atmosphere that said someone else was there. Still, neither spoke. Caleb reached for the shelf above Max's head, leaning just slightly, close enough that Max could sense breath without hearing it. When he left the room, he didn't say anything, just walked away. But Max stayed where he was, towel half folded, heart pushing against his ribs like it wanted out. That night, the air felt different. They didn't talk about the proximity. They didn't need to. Later, while watching a movie neither of them were really following, Caleb passed Max the remote. Their fingers touched again. But this time, neither pulled away immediately. The contact lasted barely a second longer than necessary, but Max felt it like a signal. Unspoken. Intentional. He went to bed restless, lying awake with the soft sounds of the house settling around him. Every creak in the walls felt like it might be him. Every footstep down the hall sent his heart into motion. But Caleb didn't come. And Max hated how much he noticed that too. The next day was colder. Outside, the sky had turned to lead. Inside, Caleb was quieter than usual. Not cold, just muted, as if something was buffering his thoughts before they reached the surface. Max tried not to watch him. Failed. He saw how Caleb looked out the window during breakfast, how his jaw clenched ever so slightly when the conversation drifted toward families. Max talking about his sister's new baby, Caleb offering a single nod in reply. There was no mention of parents. No names. Max didn't ask. The questions hung in the air between them, but neither reached for them. Instead, they hovered at the edge of things like dust and late sunlight, always visible, never touched. That afternoon, while reorganizing the pantry, Max dropped a glass jar. It didn't break, but it echoed. Caleb came in almost instantly, asking if everything was okay. Max said it was. Caleb didn't leave right away. Instead, he leaned against the counter, arms crossed, not speaking, just watching, not judging, not curious, just present. Max busied himself, but he could feel the weight of that gaze like a hand between his shoulder blades. Eventually, Caleb said something about going for a run and left the house without waiting for a reply. Max didn't go back to organizing. Instead, he stood in the same place for too long, staring at the door Caleb had just walked through. When Caleb returned, his shirt clung to his skin, damp with sweat. He didn't say anything as he passed Max in the hall, just gave a nod that felt heavier than usual. Later, over dinner, they finally broke the surface. Caleb mentioned something about Afghanistan. The words came slowly, carefully chosen. Not a story, not a confession, more like a map with most of the roads blacked out. Max didn't ask for more, but he listened, closely, gratefully. He understood now why silence was Caleb's native language. That night, in the dim kitchen light, Max stood pouring a glass of water when he felt it, the shift. Caleb entered the room, but this time, he didn't go around him. He stopped, close, their shoulders almost brushed. He looked at Max, not directly but enough. Enough to make Max forget how breathing worked. No words were exchanged, but Max felt the question in the pause. And though he had no answer, he didn't step back. When Caleb left the room, Max exhaled and realized he hadn't blinked in 20 seconds. By the sixth day, even the smallest actions had meaning. A shared dish towel, a half smile that came and went like a flicker of heat lightning. A moment when Max reached to adjust the volume on the TV and felt Caleb's breath behind him. None of it was accidental. None of it declared. But it was there. On the seventh morning, Max came out of the shower to find Caleb already in the hallway. The space between them narrowed to a breath. Caleb stepped aside, but not before their arms touched. Skin to skin. This time, neither flinched. And something in Max's chest cracked open. Not pain, not fear, just the sudden realization that this thing between them, this slow, impossible thing, had crossed a line without either of them naming it. That night, Max couldn't sleep. He lay still for hours, trying to ignore the way his heart reacted to footsteps beyond the wall. But sleep refused him. Around midnight, he padded barefoot to the kitchen. Caleb was already there. No lights on, just the soft glow of the fridge and the faint sound of wind outside. Caleb didn't speak. He was sitting at the table, hands folded, staring at nothing. Max hesitated in the doorway, then stepped forward. He sat down across from him. No words passed. They didn't need them. The silence said it all. Caleb's eyes moved to Max's. Held. Steady. And in that gaze was something raw. Not lust. Not longing. Something quieter. Hungrier. Max knew that if he reached out, Caleb wouldn't stop him. But he didn't. Not yet. Instead, he leaned back, let the quiet stretch, let the moment deepen. The air between them was heavy with unspoken truths. And still, no one spoke. Eventually, Caleb stood. Max expected him to leave. He didn't. He crossed behind Max's chair. Stopped. And, just for a second, his hand brushed Max's shoulder. Light. Barely there. But it stayed longer than it should have. Then he walked away. Max sat alone for a while after, still feeling that touch like a fingerprint. By now, he wasn't afraid of the feeling. He was afraid of what might happen if it stopped. It wasn't a confession. Max hadn't planned to say anything. The words slipped out in pieces, casual, almost harmless, during a late-night phone call with Jamie. He hadn't even meant for it to sound like that. Just a vague reference to feeling strange, not quite himself, and how Caleb wasn't what he expected. Jamie asked something careless, like whether his brother was still the brooding type. Max chuckled. He said something about noticing Caleb more than he thought he would. There was a pause. Then Jamie laughed, short, sharp, and not kind. Max said nothing at first. Jamie went on, speaking too loudly, not to Max but to whoever else was in the room with him. His voice blended into others. Male, brash, overlapping. They didn't know Max was still on the call. Or maybe they did and didn't care. The tone changed. They joked. About Caleb. About guys like that. About the ones who act straight until they don't. And about how some people needed a wake-up call before they did something stupid. It hit Max like a glass of cold water down the back. He didn't hang up immediately. He sat there, phone pressed to his ear, listening to his best friend, the one person he thought would understand. Mock people like him. He wasn't even sure what like him meant yet, but he knew how the words landed. They weren't about strangers. They were about him. And in that moment, something in Max fractured. The phone slid from his hand onto the mattress. He stared at the wall, jaw tight, chest hollowed out. The voice in his head, the one that told him it was okay to feel this way, to lean into whatever was unfolding with Caleb, went silent. He sat there, long after the call ended, listening to nothing. The next morning, everything looked the same, but Max was not. He moved through the house like a ghost, avoiding eye contact, keeping his shoulders square and his hands in his pockets. Caleb noticed the shift, but didn't ask. He never did. Instead, he watched, like always, but with more restraint now, more space between them. The tension had turned cold. Max kept himself busy. He cleaned, reorganized shelves, went out for groceries he didn't need, and responded to work emails that didn't require answers. Anything to stay out of his own head. By late afternoon, the silence between him and Caleb felt clinical. No longer intimate. Just vacant. When Max finally sat down in the living room, Caleb joined him. Not beside him, just in the same space. There was no TV, no music. Only the quiet hum of a fridge and the distant sound of wind brushing the windows. Max didn't look at him. He didn't have to. Caleb knew. He didn't press, but his presence changed. He moved less, spoke even less. Max wondered if he sensed it. The betrayal still bleeding inside him. Not from Caleb, but from someone he'd trusted with the most vulnerable part of himself. The thing about disappointment is that it doesn't shout. It settles in like dust. It sits with you in the spaces where laughter used to be. That evening, Max stood outside on the porch, arms crossed, watching the sky lose color. Caleb joined him without a word. They stood there, side by side, breathing the same air. Not touching, not speaking. Max didn't know what he expected. A question, a glance, something. But Caleb just stood quietly, not asking, not assuming. Eventually, Max said he was going for a walk. Caleb said nothing. Max walked aimlessly, hands jammed in his hoodie pocket, head down. He passed neighbors he didn't recognize, cars he'd never seen. The cold didn't bother him. The ache inside his chest did. By the time he returned, the house was dark except for the kitchen light. He found Caleb cleaning up. He didn't look surprised to see Max back. Just nodded toward the table where a plate was left out, untouched, but warm. Max sat down without a word. Ate slowly, not because he was hungry, but because it gave his hand something to do. Caleb leaned against the counter, arms crossed, watching. Then he said something low, careful. He said that sometimes the people who are supposed to know you best turn out to know nothing at all. That sometimes home isn't where you're understood. It's just where you grew up. Max didn't lift his head, but the words cracked something loose. He asked, quietly, how long Caleb had been hiding. The silence that followed wasn't defensive. It was full. Caleb told him, not everything, just enough. That he'd spent most of his adult life swallowing versions of himself to survive. That in the military, no one asked, and he gave them nothing. That pretending was easier than losing what little piece he had left. Max listened, eyes on his plate, breath shallow. Then Caleb said something that made Max's hand stop midair. He said Max reminded him of someone from before. Someone who saw through the surface. Someone who made it harder to pretend. Max looked up then. Caleb didn't smile, but his face had changed. Softer. Exposed. He didn't offer solutions. Didn't say it would be okay. He didn't need to. Just being there, speaking that truth was enough. Later that night, Max sat alone in the guest room, staring at the ceiling. His phone buzzed again. Jamie, this time asking if everything was good. Max didn't reply. He deleted the message, turned the phone face down, and lay there in the dark, heart caught between anger and relief. He had lost something that day. Trust, maybe, but he had found something else. Not in Caleb's words, but in his silence. The next morning was quieter than usual. Caleb didn't ask about the walk. Max didn't mention the call. They moved around the kitchen like they had dozens of times before, but now with a different rhythm. Slower. Intentional. As Max passed Caleb a mug, their fingers brushed. This time, Caleb didn't move away. And neither did Max. No words were needed. Something had shifted. Not forward. Not back. But inward. Where things become real. Max had packed by instinct, not decision. The bag sat by the door, half-zipped. His toothbrush in the side pocket. Phone charger wound too tightly. He hadn't told Caleb he was leaving. Not directly. But he suspected it didn't need to be said. The distance between them had stretched across the day like slow bruising. Quiet and purple. It had started that morning, with Max waking before the light, suddenly certain that staying longer would undo whatever fragile calm he'd managed to rebuild. Jamie would be back soon. And Max didn't want to be in that house when the door opened and old dynamics returned, threatening to erase the strange, silent thing that had taken root between him and Caleb. Throughout the day, they moved around each other like ghosts still learning their names. At lunch, Max left his half-eaten sandwich untouched. Caleb noticed, said nothing. By mid-afternoon, Max had decided. But deciding didn't make leaving easier. In the early evening, he folded the blanket from the couch, the one Caleb had left for him that first night, and placed it carefully back in the linen closet. He stood there longer than he should have, hand resting on the shelf, jaw set. He didn't want to go. but he couldn't name a reason to stay that didn't sound like hope wearing someone else's coat. When Caleb came in from the garage, Max was sitting at the kitchen table, keys on the counter, his duffel beside the door. Caleb's footsteps paused, then resumed. The sound of water from the sink filled the silence like static. Max didn't turn. He didn't need to. The quiet between them was no longer absence. It was a language neither of them had fully learned to speak, but both understood. There was no confrontation, no dramatic line, no desperate attempt to hold him back. Caleb dried his hands. He walked over, and then he stopped. Max finally looked up. Caleb didn't ask why he was leaving. He didn't offer a reason for him to stay. Instead, he reached out, slowly, carefully, and placed a hand on Max's shoulder. It was a small thing, gentle, human, but it landed with the weight of everything they hadn't said. Max closed his eyes for a second. Just one. And in that second, he remembered the way Caleb stood beside him on the porch. The way he didn't press when Max was hollowed out. The way he admitted, with nothing but silence, that he saw him, fully. When Max opened his eyes again, Caleb's hand was still there. It didn't move. It didn't ask. It simply stayed. And Max did too. That night, the bag remained by the door, untouched. Dinner was quieter than usual, but not tense. They didn't pretend everything was fine. They simply let the quiet carry what they couldn't yet say aloud. Afterward, Max washed the dishes. Caleb dried. Their movements were calm, instinctual. Every so often, their hands brushed. Neither pulled away. The silence between them had changed again. It wasn't a wall or a fog. It was air, breathable, warm. When they finished, Max leaned against the counter, arms crossed, unsure of what to do next. Caleb stood beside him, not facing him, but near enough that the space between their shoulders felt purposeful. No one moved for a while. Then Caleb turned just slightly. His eyes met Max's, and the look was clear, not demanding, not uncertain, just open. It asked nothing, promised nothing, but it said, "I'm here." And for the first time in a long while, Max didn't feel the need to flee his own skin. Later, in the hallway, Max paused outside the guest room. He stood with his hand on the doorknob, staring at the grain in the wood. He didn't know what it was that kept him still. The echo of Caleb's hand on his shoulder, the stillness of the kitchen, the look that asked him to stay without saying a word. He let go of the doorknob, turned around, found Caleb standing at the other end of the hall, leaning lightly against the wall. Neither of them moved. And then Caleb did something small. He tilted his head, barely perceptible, an invitation not toward anything specific, but toward the space between them, toward stillness, toward presence. Max didn't walk over. He didn't need to. He just stood there. And for a long moment, they existed like that. Two people in the same corridor, hearts beating in separate chests, but something shared pulsing between them. Eventually, they both stepped back into their respective rooms. No words, no promises, just a pause and a choice. Max lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling, no longer trying to sleep. The silence wasn't heavy anymore. It wasn't filled with things unsaid, but with what had finally been understood. He wasn't afraid of how he felt. He wasn't even afraid that Caleb might not feel the same. What mattered was the honesty of it, the not hiding. In the morning, the house was filled with soft movement. Coffee being made, water running, no tension, just the sound of people moving in a rhythm that hadn't been forced. Max walked into the kitchen. Caleb was already there. He looked up and smiled, not fully, not broadly, but real. That was enough. They shared coffee without commentary. They passed plates, mugs, glances. And when Max brushed past Caleb near the sink, he didn't flinch when a hand steadied his back, briefly, gently. No words were exchanged. But Max stayed. Not because he was asked to, because, for once, he wasn't running. Not from discomfort. Not from fear. Not from himself. The morning unfolded with no urgency. There was no alarm, no sudden need to rush anywhere. Just soft light seeping through blinds, the quiet clink of dishes in the distance, and the smell of something warm and familiar wafting into the hallway. Max got up slowly, not because he was tired, but because he wasn't. His body had rested, but his mind was still wrapped in what the night had offered. Not drama, not declarations, but something steadier. Something that didn't need a name to exist. In the kitchen, Caleb was already there. He didn't speak. Max didn't either. They didn't need to. One plate was already on the table. The second followed. Coffee had already been poured. There was a rhythm to it now. Unspoken, unrehearsed. Just two people moving in sync, not out of routine, but out of understanding. Max sat down. They ate. Quietly. Slowly. The silence wasn't awkward anymore. It was filled with the things that used to get in the way. Tension, fear, uncertainty, now dissolved into something still and mutual. At one point, Max looked up. Caleb was watching him, not with intensity, not with hesitation, just present. Max didn't smile. He didn't need to. And Caleb didn't look away. When breakfast was over, they cleaned together. Nothing rushed. Nothing overly helpful. No one trying to impress the other. They moved around each other without touching, but every motion acknowledged the other's presence. Max wiped the counter. Caleb dried the mugs. When their hands brushed again, they didn't linger, but neither did they avoid it. Later, Max opened the front door. The morning was cool but calm. No noise on the street, no wind to speak of, just stillness. He stood there for a moment before Caleb appeared beside him. No words, no question, just shared space. They stepped outside together. The walk wasn't planned. There was no route. They moved slowly without aim. Side by side. Max kept his hands in his pockets at first. Caleb did too. The houses blurred past, but neither of them noticed the details. The world around them was quiet, soft-edged, as if it understood something important was taking shape and had decided not to interrupt. They didn't talk about Jamie, or the past few days, or the unsaid things that had grown between them. They just walked. And somewhere near the edge of the neighborhood, where the sidewalk curved beneath a patch of trees, it happened. Caleb's hand brushed against Max's again. Once, then again, and the third time, it didn't retreat. He took it, simply, quietly. Max didn't flinch. He didn't freeze. He let it happen. Their fingers wove together, warm and certain. Not possessive, not seeking permission. Just there, present. Max exhaled, a breath he hadn't realized he was holding, and let the quiet fill him. It didn't feel sudden. It didn't feel risky. It felt inevitable. He didn't look over. Caleb didn't either. They just walked like that. Two figures moving in step, hands clasped like it had always been meant that way. There was no need for confirmation. No conversation that started with "What are we?" No anxiety clawing at the edge of joy. Just stillness. Just being. When they returned to the house, neither of them let go right away. They stood by the porch, looking out toward the street, hands still locked, the morning now turning toward afternoon. It wasn't about what might come next. It wasn't about declarations or decisions. It was about this. The now. The knowing. Eventually, they stepped inside. Max didn't move toward the guest room. He followed Caleb instead. Not with expectation, not because something was supposed to happen, but because the air between them had shifted again. And this time, it didn't feel like tension or waiting. It felt like arrival. Later, when they sat together on the porch again, the sun dipping behind rooftops, Max rested his head back, eyes closed. Caleb didn't say anything. He didn't need to. And when he shifted slightly, letting their shoulders touch, Max leaned into it, just enough to say, "I know." The silence stayed with them. Long after the wind picked up. Long after the streetlights blinked to life. And when the sky finally dimmed into blue-black, and Max looked over, Caleb was still watching the horizon. Still quiet. Still present. Max reached up, brushed his fingers lightly against Caleb's wrist. It was barely a touch, but it said more than any words ever could. "I see you, and I'm not afraid anymore."